This video, we're going to answer some of our most frequently asked carbon market related questions. We have Casey here, who's our producer, going to help us by asking the questions to Dr. Shockley and myself.
All right, so can you tell us what's driving carbon markets?
Yeah, that's a popular question out there. You know, when I think about carbon markets and, you know, the full picture, there's really three main drivers of carbon market programs. First is the conscientious consumer, you know, that buyer out there that's making purchasing decisions based on environmentally friendly products, right? Two would be stakeholders, you know, publicly traded companies. Stakeholders are looking for companies to disclose the environmental risk that their investment, if they're going to put money into that company, they want to know what that risk from environmental concerns would be. And then last but not least is international trade. A lot of these companies are global in nature, and you can imagine that environmental policies in Europe are different than environmental policies in the US, and so international trade's been a big deal. And so those are kind of the three big drivers of carbon markets today.
Jordan, I think it's interesting. One of the drivers you did not just mention of carbon markets was the government. Can you explain that to us?
That is correct. For the life of this, since the newest evolution of carbon credits, the government's been out of it. They're letting things play out. Where they have gotten involved is putting rules in place so that companies don't make egregious claims on the environmental side of things. But from a consumer level standardization, they've been kind of hands off and continue to be into the future.
All right, Tiffany, why would a producer be interested in carbon credits?
Well, I think it's an interesting question, and the data shows us that a lot of producers aren't, Jordan, right? There are a lot of producers that have just decided that entering into carbon markets and trying to sell carbon credits as offsets or participate in inset programs is not something that all producers are interested in. So that's the first part of the answer. For those that are interested in it, I think for most of them, they just see it as a potential additional revenue source, right? When you're looking at margins as low as they often are in farming, any way to increase your revenue, I think a lot of producers got involved, particularly in the offset side of the market that way. As we see markets shift and evolve, and this is really your area, so it's funny that I'm answering this question, but as we see markets shift and evolve though now, I think that there are some producers who are seeing companies that maybe they're selling to, right? Their buyers are, instead of giving them the option to voluntarily enter into the market, may say, hey, if you choose not to enter into the market, you can't sell to us. Yes. Or we're going to take a discount on your product. And so some producers are entering in the market that way because of just market forces kind of demanding that they do so.
Dr. Shockley, I know you've heard this in Kentucky, and Tiffany, I'm sure we've heard it here in Texas, but can you tell us, is this just feel-good crap?
Well, it's typical extension answer. Well, it depends, right? When you look at the overall carbon market space and what these companies are doing and offering, you know, there are companies out there that are for sure, you know, want to be better environmental stewards, right? I mean, there's no doubt in my mind about that. But there are companies out there that are using this as a marketing scheme, and there's no doubt about that. So I think to answer the question, it depends on the company, but there are both sides of the coin on this.
And I think that sort of plays into that too. A couple more things I would add there. One of them is that I think it plays into it a little bit when we don't have some sort of like standard measurement or standard agreement on how things exactly are going to be rated. That plays into the questions about like, hey, how legit is this when there's not something standard like that set in the industry? The other thing I'll say is I think that we're going to see some pushback on that from a legal perspective because we are starting to see lawsuits filed against companies. And I don't know whether the companies in the lawsuits have made claims that are viable or feel-good crap, as our question asks, right? We'll let the court sort that out. But I do think that we're seeing some pushback on these claims along those lines.
Okay, Tiffany, I know you've had this question plenty of times before, but are we allowed to shoot the drones down?
Yeah, it is a favorite question of folks in West Texas, and I think probably in Kentucky too. I think you get the same question. One reason we're answering a drone question in a carbon-related program, let me just be clear on this. A lot of times when you enter into a carbon contract, one of the things you agree to is you allow that company to collect data on your property. And for many of those contracts, that data does include drone flights over the property. And if you don't read the fine print in the contract, you may not know that, but that's something that you've agreed to. So that's why the drone question comes up. The answer emphatically to can you shoot down the drone is no, don't do it. And the reason for that is drones are actually federally regulated by the FAA. as you might imagine, there are pretty stiff penalties for shooting down federally regulated aircraft. So absolutely do not shoot the drones down. Whether it's something you've contractually agreed to or not, I know it's frustrating, still can't shoot the drone at the sky. Don't do it.
All right, Dr. Shockley, can we anticipate price increases in the pricing of carbon credits?
Yeah, I mean, in short answer, I think yes. We've seen prices steadily go up that companies are offering farmers and ranchers in this carbon credit space. I think, traditional economic theory on supply and demand, right? A lot of these claims for companies looking to be greenhouse gas neutral is sometime, it could be 2030, 2040, right? And as we get closer to those claims, those demands for carbon credits for companies to reach their goals are going to increase. And so you should see prices increase. Now, will it ever reach what we need it to be to cover the cost of implementing the practices that are required with some of these contracts? I hope so, but we're still a far ways away from where we are today.
Tiffany, why am I not eligible?
Yeah, and this is a question, Jordan, I think you probably get this a lot at producer meetings, right? Why, my neighbor signed a carbon contract, but the company's telling me I'm not eligible. Why is that? Well, it could be a number of different reasons, right? I think one of the most common ones, particularly in your part of the world, right, is this concept of additionality. And so for producers entering into carbon offset contracts, right, where you're going to say, I'm going to adopt some sort of climate-friendly practice like no-till or cover crops, right? If I'm going to start doing that, and that is going to make a change, right, in the amount of emissions from my operation, I can be paid for that, right? That company will pay me for that carbon credit. That's how offsets work. If you were an early adopter of those practices, right, if you're somebody who's already been using cover crops or already adopted no-till, under most offset contracts, you wouldn't qualify to get paid, right, to sell that credit because there wasn't a change, right? You didn't make a change that changed the emissions from your property. So historically, for a lot of people, that's been the issue as to why they can't qualify. I will say, as we see carbon markets shift, and we do have a fact sheet and a video talking about this kind of shift from offsets to insets, where companies are now looking at their own supply chain to reduce emissions rather than this idea of selling or buying carbon credits. It does seem that additionality is not near as important. And so you may be able to participate in some of the inset programs, even if you've been doing cover crops for a number of years, whereas you may have been out when it came to offsets.
Yes, I had the unfortunate job of getting in front of farmers for the past 4 or 5 years and saying, you're not eligible. So that's been a concern, but as we move forward, I think the ability to participate in these markets and get paid for doing the right things, because like the farmer's sitting there saying, I've been doing this for 50 years, why can't I participate? This makes no sense. You're paying the bad actors to make changes and not paying me. So luckily we're seeing an evolution and move towards a relaxed constraint there on that additionality concept.
Why would I sell my carbon credits and not just keep them for myself?
Yeah, that's a question I get often, right? And I think the concern is if you're signing a 10-year contract or 20-year contract, right, for generating carbon credits, and then a company that you traditionally sell to, right, let's an ADM, a Bunge, whatever grain elevator, has now a requirement that it's their insetting program and you've got to do X, Y, and Z to sell to them, you've got a conflict of interest, right? And so how you're seeing farmers kind of pause and saying, you know what, I don't want to give up the rights of my carbon credits because at some point I may have to prove that I'm greenhouse gas neutral. And if I've sold away all my carbon credits, how do I then prove that that happens? And so there is some concern, and that gets brought up a lot. And I think it's going to be farmer to farmer dependent on what they do. But I think that is going into some of the decision making at the farmer level of enrolling in some of these carbon contracts, especially those of long term. When you're talking 30, 40 years, 50-year contracts. I mean, some of them are 100 years in the woodland space. That's That's a long time to be giving up your rights to anything.
And I think super important too, when you're looking at those contracts, the reason it's problematic is when you enter into one of those contracts, you specifically say, for a lot of them, they have a provision that says you cannot enroll in any other carbon program, or you can't profit off of these practices from any other like related method. And so if you go in and you get your, let's say it's $20 per ton of carbon stored, if you get that under the contract, but then it says you can't use it again, then you're sunk when you go to ADM and they say, well, we're only going to take it if it also basically comes with this carbon credit. And so those contracts are really, again, why it's so important to read the contract and understand those terms, because for a lot of people, when they signed up, they never dreamed that there would be this other situation where they would need to have that carbon credit. And as the markets have changed, that's become a real problem.
One of the last questions that came in is, will the government have their hand in the carbon market?
You know, I get this question a lot, right? Especially since we've seen the transition in administration over the past, few months. And so, before, the government for the years really didn't have their hand in this carbon market space, right? They were letting things play out. There was some legislation that was going to come through USDA to do like basically a stamp of, a certified carbon credit, which would then basically standardize the way you measure that. That was retracted in December of 2022, and we haven't really seen any movement in this space yet. Will the current administration have their hands in it? I think indirectly, and you're starting to see it a little bit. Companies, kind of retracting away from some of the aggressive targets that they set.
Things like carbon neutral by 2030 or something like that.
Or the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Initiative, which was part of the Green New Deal, really hasn't been, as of today, March of 2025, there hasn't been any new legislation that has been certified yet. So I think it's still to be determined. I think if we do see the government have their hands in it, I think it will look different than what it did previously, because it really was a hands-off approach. And so it may be more farmer friendly rather than environmentally friendly, but still have the same kind of characteristics underneath. So it's to be determined.